Hi, and welcome to Random Walks in HR with me, Tim Peffers, and today we're talking about DEI, how to measure it. Specifically, how to measure it beyond just measuring a small part of that D, the small part of the diversity, right? Because this is the problem with DEI. We talk about inclusion and belonging and uniqueness and equity and fairness, but actually what we tend to measure is just the D part, and actually it's just males and females. What's our male female ratio of senior leaders or managers across the whole organization, right? So how do we measure DEI? And I think it's important we know this because DEI is one of the fastest growing, most important areas within HR, right? Over the last 10 years, it's gone from maybe one person organization to, huge teams, but also huge priorities for the organization, partly to do with, movements like, the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, but also to do with something called CSR, so corporate social responsibility. Essentially, investment funds and private investors really want to invest in companies who are doing good things, right? They're being sustainable, they're helping with climate change, they're, taking responsibility for some of the things they're doing. And one of the ways that companies are showing that they are a good company with good CSR is they're putting targets around things like gender diversity, right? They're showing that actually we're pushing back the gender barriers and we're being more of an equalitarian organization. And if they're achieving those things, they are boosting their share prices because funds are more likely to invest in them. What we've seen really since the pandemic, especially the Black Lives Matter movement and so on, is that the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer role has been growing rapidly. It's the fastest, or was fastest growing role at the C-suite level from 2019 to 2022. However, that's actually gone in reverse for the last few years, right? Now, why is that? Got a few theories on it, but one may be putting a lot of energy into things, doing lots of things like setting up ERGs and doing unconscious bias training and all these other things, these webcasts and so on, but how are we actually measuring delivery? How is actually improving the organization's bottom line? Well, actually, we don't know. Why? Well, because how do we measure DI? Well, we measure diversity. Okay, that's useful. And we do know there's lots of biases against females. There's lots of things that work against them within the organisation, subconscious or even sometimes systematic problems. But actually, if we just measure males and females, we lose out on this whole thing around intersectionality, right? Not all females are the same, and not just females who have biases against them. There are biases against other demographics, such as Asians, such as people of colour. And therefore, when you combine those two, there's what's called a compounding effect, right? When you have a black woman, for example, they have all the negative biases associated with being a female, but also all the negative biases associated with being black. So essentially, it makes it even harder. So if we're just measuring diversity of male and female, we're actually missing out. We're not really getting a good idea of the biases and the real systematic problems within organizations. That's before we even talk about inclusion. That's just, counting who we have. Actually, can they have a voice at the table? Can they contribute? Are they actually able to be themselves? These are questions that most organizations are really only scratching the surface. Most organizations will just ask something like, oh, can you be yourself at work? Which is a really problematic question on a number of levels. But I think the best way to sum it up is there's a humorist called David Sedaris who once said, just be yourself, unless yourself is an asshole. So actually, how do we measure inclusion? Now, I've used this model before, where we look at access, where we look at participation, can I be involved, we look at fairness, am I being treated equally based on my skills, capabilities, uniqueness, can I be myself, and belonging, do I feel like I can be here long term? Now, those two things are different, right? I can be unique but not feel I can be here long term, but also I can feel I can belong, but I have to be someone else to fit in, right? So 5 different things plus psychological safety, which is super important if you're not being treated fairly, or you're not being involved and able to participate, or you can't speak up if you're seeing something that's wrong. So quite a lot to measure there just for inclusion. And also there's some overlap with potentially equity, right? And what do we mean by equity? Is it equity? Is it equality? Is equal pay a good measure of, are you an equitable organization? Could be, but then you need to have a certain amount of infrastructure, to have job role categories and architecture to be able to measure it quite easily. Can you use something like gender pay gaps as a sign of equity? Maybe, but actually those calculations tend to be for just countries, right? So how do you measure gender pay gap at a global scale, accounting for different costs of living in different countries? And also equity, I mean, can we just measure it using the quantitative data that we have? Because actually really equity should be about, can I get what I need? So actually, can you just measure it through equal salary analysis and audits, and also maybe some metrics around promotion rates by performance score, to see if there are different standards of promotion rates for males and females, for example? Or do we actually need some of that kind of personal data like inclusion, where it's more around feelings and my personal needs, and do I feel that those are being met? So these are some of the questions I really want to get into as part of the capstone project. Why? Well, I think DEI is important, both from the CSR and organisation point of view, but also I feel it's important personally, especially around the fairness angle. But I also think it has to be done right. So, for example, when we started looking into inclusion and how to measure it, what we found was there was this interesting thing called racial victimhood. Now, quick bit of mansplaining here. Racial victimhood is when essentially it's a fairly new strand of research where people have looked at things like the Black Lives Matter movement and then asked the question, why is there such a big, strong reaction from people who are not black, like the All Lives Matter movement, right? And what they found essentially is whenever there are things, movements or measurements or programs or sort of facilities to help people from underrepresented groups or a certain demographic, like say females, those who are not from that demographic then feel disadvantaged, right? They feel there's only a certain amount of jobs in the world, or there's only so many manager roles, so therefore if you're helping this group, then actually I'm being disadvantaged, right? So there's a big pushback in terms of they're now feeling victimized and being treated unfairly. The interesting thing is, research has shown that the more things that you put in, the more programs, the more measurements, the more metrics, the more initiatives, the more then those groups who are not being aided feel victimized, right? Now I will just say I'm not making the case against those on behalf of all white men. We're doing fine, so don't worry. But for me, the question is, how, if we're going to start measuring different elements of the DEI or DEI and J or whatever the new things are, we've got to be conscious of how many metrics we're putting in, but also how we're positioning them, how we're communicating them. DEI has to be for the good of everyone, so everyone wins by having stronger DEI performance and policies, right? So how do we make sure that we are basically putting in a DEI framework, a DEI measurement policy that is ethical and most importantly inclusive, right? So this is the goal. Define a model for DEI, develop standardized techniques and data source for measurement, and make sure that that is inclusive, so everything that we put in doesn't then marginalize and make other people feel attacked, which is potentially why we've seen a huge explosion in chief diversity and inclusion officers, and now there's a recession, right? Are all the things that we're putting in getting pushed back? So how do we make sure that when we move forward, we're doing this ethically, but also bringing everyone with us? So this is idea number 3 for my master's capstone project. If you find it interesting, please do check out the previous 2 videos where we talk about performance against expectations, but also we talk about expected engagement, expected collaboration as well. So there's a couple of interesting ideas. We'd love to hear your feedback. Please comment below or find me on LinkedIn and I'll put in a quick session to discuss and have a chat. Anyway, I hope this hasn't been a complete waste of your time, and thank you for watching.